Yes, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Piret Norhaja, and I am the Chief Archivist of VEMU, Estonian Museum, Canada. And it's my pleasure to welcome you to the conference, The Great Escape of 1944, the Baltic Experience. We are delighted to have you with us. Thanks for coming from far and near. The Second World War left over 400,000 people of Eastern and Central Europe, including over 200,000 Baltic people, homeless, creating entire communities of displaced persons, DPs, in West Germany, Austria, Italy, Great Britain, Norway, and Sweden after the war, the majority of whom later emigrated to North and South America and Australia. World War II formed a new generation which some historians call a diaspora of the highest maturity, and which gave the Baltic states such personalities as the President of the Republic of Lithuania, Valdas Adamkus, and the President of the Republic of Latvia, Vairānike Freiberga, and the President of the Republic of Estonia, Toomas Hendrik Ilves. The DPs, phenomenon of the 20th century, symbolizes the loss of home, the separation of families, and the fragmentation of nations, as well as the irreversible change in the social fabric of their countries. At the same time, they are instrumental for the three Baltic states in the struggle for freedom and independence, which all three of them regained in the 1990s. There are times when we must stick together. Our conference commemorates the 80th anniversary of the Great Escape of 1944, but this is also the third year of the war in Ukraine. Both in the homeland and in the diaspora, this war has again brought to mind the wounds that were inflicted in the bodies of our nations 80 years ago. How does it define us today? We will probably hear about it in the conference presentations and discussions. Many thanks to all panelists for their contribution. Guest speakers will include academic researchers, filmmakers, authors, and historical heritage preservationists, all coming from Canada, Estonia, US, and Netherlands. Our sincerest thanks goes also to our major funder, Estonian Foundation Canada, our sponsors, Estonia Central Council in Canada, Integration Foundation in Estonia, and Tartu College, of course. Many thanks to the co-organizer of the conference and the film screening tonight, the Elmar Tampel Chair of the Estonian Studies at U of T, Professor Andres Kasekamp. I wish us all an exciting and fruitful conference, and before I give it over to Andres to moderate our next two sessions, I'd like to invite the representative of the Estonian Foundation Canada, the board, Peter Vide, to say a few words. Please, Peter.
Thank you very much. On behalf of the Estonian Foundation of Canada, we're very excited to be the major funder of the conference, and we certainly have been looking forward to it for a long time, and it's good that the day has come. A few words in Estonian. Tervitan teid Sihtkapitali juhatuse nimel. Sihtkapital on rõõm olla suurpägenemise konverentsi peatoetaja. Eesti Sihtkapital Kanadas asutati 74. aastal missiooniga hoida ja edendada Eesti kogukonda Kanadas. 50 aastat on Sihtkapital toetanud eesti keelt, haridust, kultuuri ja pärandust. Me peame eestlaste lugu rääkima oma lastele ja kogukonnale, eriti arvestades sellega, et agressorid ei ole mitte maailmast lahkunud. Ilman mäluta pole veel tulevikku, niin aitäh VEMU, et meie pärandat hoiate ja meie lugu jutustate. Thank you very much. Aitäh.
Thank you, Peter, and thank you to the foundation. I'm Andres Saueauk. I'm the chair of Estonian Studies at the University of Toronto. Let me say right off the bat that this endowed chair would not exist without the contributions of the refugees and their descendants who we'll be discussing today. I'm not going to give any big introduction because we're already behind time and we've got a packed schedule, so let's get right to it. The first block is examining the events of the Second World War and the actual flight from Estonia across the sea. So I would, without further ado, invite the first speaker, Patrick Rand from Tallinn, to come up here. Patrick works as a historian, but by education he's specialized in the philosophy of science at Tallinn Technical University, but he's been working at the Estonian War Museum, which is named after General Laine, in various capacities since 2007, present as the strategy advisor to the museum. He's also won several museum awards. And he's going to be talking about his research. And when he comes up here for his presentation, you might think that he's slightly informally dressed, but this T-shirt has a message. This is a poster from the Estonian War of Independence, and it's kind of a branding logo for the Estonian War Museum.
Tere hommikust! Or good morning, so I shall switch to English. And the title of my presentation, which will be quite short because we have only 20 minutes left, is a brief overview of the events of 1941 and also some years before, and 1944 in Estonia that paved the way for the Great Escape. Right. As the beginning, I shall take actually the year 1939, as this was the year when the war, Second World War, broke out. And I shall not go and talk about events or wars in Europe in the 1930s that perhaps may have led to the Second World War, and not also to the First World War or even previous events that also had some effect on it. So, although the war started officially, so to speak, on the 1st of September 1939, for Estonia and other Baltic countries, the memorable event happened on the 23rd of August 1949, when the Molotov-Ribbentrop or Soviet-German agreement and pact was signed, which also divided roughly, say, the Eastern and Central Europe under either Germany or under Russia. And so, as the great friends, Soviet Russia and Nazi Germany were, so when the Germans started to invade Poland, then the Soviets soon followed on the 17th of September. And as this wasn't enough, then on the 30th of November, the so-called Winter War with Finland broke out, that is, the Russians attacked also Finland. And so, in the unfortunate summer of 1940, Estonia was incorporated into the Soviet Union. I will not go into the details, just this was the briefly timeline. So, now in 1941, I think that already the events that happened in 1940 quite shaped the attitude of Estonian population towards the Soviet force. Or, as Estonian writer and later also refugee, Arvo Mägi, in his memories, has quoted one elderly lady in Tartu waiting for the us to come oota teist nagu Hitlerit, wait for Hitler to come, waiting for Hitler to come. But as we all know, when Hitler finally came and Germany attacked Soviet Union, then this wasn't a remarkable change for the better. And so again, quote, this time from folklore, "Meil öö päästis ööli pääst." Well, one robber saved us from another robber. So things went on pretty badly as well. But yes, the key event in 1941, prior to the war between Germany and Soviet Union, was the mass deportation on June 14th, where approximately 10,000 people from Estonia were taken to Siberia. So, when the war broke out in 1941, the German Army Group North was to capture Leningrad or St. Petersburg as of today. And conquering Estonia and also Latvia and Lithuania, it was just a part of the plan. They were on their way. And defending Estonia from the Soviet point of view was the 8th Red Army, which retreated from Lithuania. And besides the let's say, regular army, the 8th Army, there were also the so-called extermination battalions, or Hävitus battalion in Estonia, that were formed by the local communists and also Latvian communists who retreated from Latvia. And let's say from the Estonian point of view, there were the first Forest brothers, or Metsainad, who tried to fight mainly the Russians, but also they had some, not exactly clashes, but some savings or also with the forthcoming German forces. And the Soviet army was pretty bad or pretty weak in its defense, because Tallinn was freed from the Soviets already on August the 28th, and the Hiljar as the last part of Estonia on October the 21st. Actually, there were a small garrison left on the island of Osmussaar off the northern coast, but on a large scale, this doesn't really matter. And as talking is boring, then also two pictures. One is from the, this one is from the so-called Soviet side. This is the Tallinn residents who were forced to participate in digging anti-tank trenches in Halko, some at that time perhaps 20 kilometers from Tallinn, today maybe 10. And a picture from the German side where we can see the first advanced units having reached Tammela on July the 8th, 1941. And all along the way there were quite heavy, not as heavy as today in Ukraine, but still quite heavy battles. In some places, for example, also near Berlin, but not always. So if we come to the next years of 1942 and 1943, then from the military point of view, it was a relatively quiet time in Estonia, because the events happened elsewhere, and mainly from the Estonian point of view mattered the battles of Stalingrad and Kursk, respectively in 1942 and 1943. And there was extremely heavy fighting in both of these battles. Germans lost both of them, and this indicated, at least for the Estonians, what was to come in the future. So actually, I think that the majority of already started to feel and understand that Germans will lose this war, and now we have to take care of ourselves and see what happens next. And people started to flee from Estonia. There was the organized resettlement of Estonian Swedes to, not Estonia, pardon my mistake, it's of course to Sweden. And this happened in 1943 and 44, and approximately some 6,000 or 7,000 Swedes were officially and resettled according to the agreement between the German authorities and also the Swedish kingdom. And quite several of those people had, let's say, a little tilt of Swedish blood in their but they were able to prove it through church records that their grandmother or great-grandfather actually was Swedish, and so some of them were actually pure Estonians, but still had the possibility to live under this clause. And then there were young men who were not willing to serve in the German army, and so they left for Finland, in Estonian known as Suomenpoisid, or translated as Finnish boys, and there were some 3,000 of them. And of course there were, let's say, minor unorganized escapes, people on the seashore just leaving by boat or fleeing from the German conscription, or some were definitely just looking for adventures, but these two categories are the main ones, others are quite small. And unfortunately, I don't think you can see much of this picture, but this is a drawing of Victor Rosen's daughter. Victor Rosen was one of the Swedes that left Naissaar in 1943, and her daughter later in her life drew this picture depicting all of the items that were on the boat, where they located, what they were, as you can see there's even a bike. So they took all their living with them. As it was an organized resettlement, they had more time for that. And so what happened in 1944? Then the so-called peaceful times, or relatively peaceful times, were over, as the Red Army launched a strategic offensive against the German Army Group North in January 1944. And by February, they were on the Estonian borders, mainly near Narva. And this was not an offence only towards Estonia, it was on a longer or lengthier front line. And in March 1944, the Soviet forces bombed Narva and Tallinn. But despite this, and despite being on the border already in February, the Soviet forces didn't manage to break through, and so it was all on a standstill by April 1944, and it was impossible for any of the sides to gain any major victory, because also the climatic conditions started to worsen. Melting snow, no more ice, you cannot cross the river Narva or Lake Peipsi. And so it was a real standstill for a couple of months. In July, the Red Army started another offensive, and so they forced the Germans and also the Estonian units that were not only Estonian but Flemish and Danish and other conscripted units of German forces to Sinimäed or Blue Hills, not too far from Narva. And there were very fierce battles going on in July 1944 there. The Red Army lost approximately 40,000 soldiers, German units up to 10,000, of which some 3,000 were Estonians. But again, the Soviets couldn't get through, and so they had to come round, so to speak, from the south side across River Emajõgi. And only then it was clear that Estonia had been conquered. And so this also meant the withdrawal of German troops in September 1944, some 80 years back. There were some really desperate attempts to fight for the Soviets, for example.
Against the Soviets?
Sorry?
To fight against the Soviets? No.
To fight against the Soviets, yeah. For example, the Itka, which is named after Admiral John Itka, who called for the boys to come and fight. Let's make it a war of independence, Volume 2. It was he was a very kind of brave, but not perhaps too brave man, but I'm not sure whether he understood the situation from that point of view, that it wasn't 1918 anymore. And so these attempts were indeed really desperate. But on the other side, the feeling among the young men in Estonia, it was quite certain that yes, let's fight now, it's our generations and it's our war in independence. But well, as we all know, the Red Army entered Tallinn on September the 22nd, and the last German troops retreated from Sõrve on November 25th, Sõrve is in Saueauk. And although the Germans tried to keep as much as possible to avoid allowing Estonians to escape, there was mass exodus in the summer and autumn already in 1944. The Germans captured the boats, but they soon released those who tried to escape. But let's say that from the beginning of August and to the beginning of October, there was a real mass exodus, mass escape. And later on, when the Germans had understood that, well, the war is over, at least here in Estonia, they started to have also organized escapes or the organized resettlement. And so larger ships were sent to Germany with thousands of refugees on it, kind of independent or individual fleeing, based mainly from the seashore to Sweden. So we can call it spontaneous. And so approximately 70 to 80,000 people fled. And here we have a picture of Tallinn after the bombing in March 1944. Here we have a Soviet kind of a propaganda road sign motivating the Red Army to go onward to the west, edasi läände, period nazad, dating from July 1944. And on the other hand, here we have the fighters of the Estonian Legion being sworn in 1944. And so, a brief summary of what I have been talking about is that the activities of the Soviet power in 1944, 40 and 41 caused a complete shift in the attitude towards the Germans, because the Germans were known as the 700 years of serfdom under the Germans. But only 1 year or so that the rule regime changed it, but the disappointment was fast to emerge because the Germans didn't want to know anything about Estonian independence. It was just a part of the Reich and that's it. But however, the events in 1940 and 1941 were so vividly in the memories of Estonians that fight against the forthcoming Red Army in 1944 was quite intense and people were willing to do it. Just as we're quoting from yet again another refugee whom most of you know either personally or at least by name, Vello Salo. Liitlane võis meil vale olla, aga vaenlane õige, meaning that the ally could have been the wrong one, but the enemy was definitely the right one. So he was also in the German army, starting from being a Soome voice or Finnish boy in 1943 and later in the German army in 1944. But those often desperate attempts to stop the Soviets in the Blue Hills or on the river Emajõgi or the Pitkapoisid, their desperate fights, these all enabled actually the roughly 70 to 80,000, let's call it 75,000 people from Estonia to escape. And yes, that's the case. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Patrick. So this first lecture was setting the scene and the context, and you did a very good job with that. I think the way forward now is if there are any sort of quick, sort of factual questions to Patrick, they can be asked now. But otherwise, I think we'll hold the sort of discussion to after when all the speakers have spoken. So if there's anything quick and factual, Tom?
How was the Estonian government prepared for war on September 1, 1939?
Discussion.
Well, not very good, as far as I know. Because, first of all, times were changed. It was not a kind of chaos in Russia anymore. The Soviet Russia was now well established. It was highly industrialized. They had been preparing for a kind of war or other military expedition for, let's say, at least a decade, all this industrialization process. Not talking or comparing the sizes of Estonia and Soviet Russia, but also if we see the level of militarization in the societies. Estonians, of course, were very patriotic and so forth, but still, if we see the number of tanks, the number of heavy machine guns, the number of armored trains that was still relevant at that time, the differences are enormous. And Estonia wasn't particularly prepared, I would say, because also the economic crisis in the 1930s, it affected. And just like today, there were very heated discussions on how to spend the public money. Should we invest into this or that? Should we buy new weaponry and what kind of weaponry? And so, yes, I would conclude that we were not particularly ready for the war. We called ourselves neutral. And just another tiny fact is that the head of the Narva garrison turned out to be a traitor, and he had sold to the Soviets at the end of 1930s also the defense plans of the Estonian eastern defense line. So yes, we were not prepared.
Ja mis on Pitka poisid?
Sorry?
Mis on Pitka poisid?
Pitka poisid, those were the young men who served under Pitka. Pitka made a kind of call or announcement that young men, come, it's your war, liberty to fight, let's beat back the Soviets and establish the Estonian Republic. And so it's just a kind of family saying that.
I can just add about Pitka. Pitka was a hero of the War of Independence, who has a Canadian connection, of course, because he created an Estonian settlement in British Columbia in the late 20s, which didn't work out very well, because the Canadian or the BC government's promises of having a rail connection to the settlement never happened. He returned to Estonia, and he spent the warriors in Finland, and he returned in '44. But he was this hero who had this aura, which managed to mobilize lots of young men around him in this, as we heard, hopeless cause, unfortunately. So let's move to the next speaker. I will invite Hiljar Tammela up to the stage, and we'll get him set up. So Hiljar is a researcher at the Estonian Institute of History and Memory. Oh, sorry, I messed that up. Estonian Institute of Historical Memory, Eesti Mälu Institute. He's a graduate of the University of Toronto. Messed that up again. University of Tartu with a master's degree in history. And his presentation will turn from the events, the context of the war, directly to the main subject today of the actual escape across the sea, and that is his main research focus, which he will be introducing. So, Hiljar, invite you up here, but try to not make another mistake.
Dear colleagues and guests, ladies and gentlemen, good morning. My name is Hiljar Tammela, and the title of my presentation is The Composition and Fate of Estonian Refugee Armada in Sweden. First, perhaps a couple of words about the terms. When we think of the word Armada, we possibly first think of some very large naval fleets in history, like the great Spanish Armada that was sent in the 16th century to invade England, which was defeated by Sir Francis Drake. But this wording, in this case, comes from one Estonian refugee newspaper called Väliseesti, which was published in Sweden already in January of 1945. And as we see, this smaller piece of news over there. The Armada of Estonian boats are being sent to Västervik, which is a port in Sweden, and they're calling these boats and ships all together as Armada, and also they're naming the Estonian mass escape to Sweden as invasion. Well, this is naturally sort of a self-ironic attitude, so to say. But the word invasion was informally used by the Swedes themselves quite broadly by this time. Mostly probably because of the whole mass of the refugees that arrived during quite a long time period, mostly in the autumn of 1944. So what is my main focus over here is the main focus is on the Estonian refugees boats and ships that made it to to Sweden, mostly in summer and autumn of 1944. And why is it important? Why should we deal with such a matter today? Well, I would say that one thing is that we know quite a little by now about this subject. How it was, how the great flight from Estonia to Sweden happened in sort of a logistical viewpoint, so to say. And the other very important aspect, I would say, is that for the people nowadays that are researching the story of their ancestors' escape from Estonia to Sweden during the World War II, the fate of vessel is probably one of the central points to start with their research, as far as I have seen. Now, if we take a look of some of the major titles that has been published in Estonia during the past couple of decades over the topic of this escape from Estonia during the Second World War, we see that quite big amount of this material is are the memoirs, or are very closely dealing with the memoirs and other ego documents, so to say, which gives us quite a good, so to say, personal perspective, or a perspective of the escape of one family. But by now, there have even emerged some new possibilities to take a look at this sort of overall general picture of it. And for example, Estonian Institute of Historical Memory has published a collection of articles this August, which is titled Põgenemine Eestist Rootsi teise maailmasõja ajal, the flight from Estonia to Sweden during World War II. The Estonian version of this book has already been published in August, as I said, but we're expecting the English version to be out of print house today or tomorrow, perhaps, and so it will be possible to obtain it from the Tartu University Press website. And there is one specifically interesting article in this book on this context, which is by the hobbyist historian from Sweden named Martin Jungerman, who has put together the list of Estonian refugees vessels that during World War II ended up in Sweden. He has visited several archives in Sweden to compile the list. And yes, probably there are some gaps in this list because not each and every vessel was registered by the Swedish authorities on several reasons. Some of them sank on the harbor while they were stationed in Sweden because they were in such a bad state. Some of them were sold to local Swedish private citizens, and this one also didn't end up in this list. But still, thanks to this work, we now have a list which constitutes something like approximately 560 Estonian refugee vessels that were registered in Sweden mostly from 1944 to 1945. And as we hopefully see from this table, right, we have several columns for this table, like vessel type, home port, date of registration in Sweden, dimensions of the vessel, and also the assembly location in Sweden, assessed value, extradition date, and also the data of owner and captain, and also. So from this table, we get to know that these boats and ships were mostly from Saaremaa, Tallinn, and Pärnumaa. Well, the difference between the ship and the boat, it may vary from different countries, from the local legislation over there, of course, from the how people call them. But in this list there are around 70 vessels that are certainly ships, not boats. So obviously the bigger ones, and approximately around 500 smaller boats. There are sailing ships, motor ships, steamships, passenger ships, tugboats, but most of the vessels in this list are motor boats. And when they ended up in Sweden, they were collected, assembled in certain harbors in Sweden, and then the Swedish government had to find the answer on the question what to do with them. The discussions lasted something like half a year or so. The Swedish press also covered the discussions. Quite many of local newspapers were absolutely sure that these boats and ships were given back to their rightful owners, so they could continue using them for making living and so on. But it quite soon was clear that it couldn't be this way. Okay. And here are a couple of pictures from the Swedish archives about these vessel assembly locations. The ones that we see on the pictures are the refugee vessels from Estonia and Latvia. And from the upper picture is some object out of the focus that we see in the center part of the picture. This is a shoot this of a photographer, so so not put much attention to it. And in May 1945, the Swedish government had reached the decision, and under significant pressure from the Soviets, the refugee vessels were about to hand over to the Soviets, because the Soviets treated it as state of the property, state of the Soviet Union, which was to given back. And quite things happened quite fast. By then, the Swedes gave the boats and ships to the Soviets. The Soviets came with tugboats the same summer to get them back. And there was a special temporary government commission instituted by the Swedish government called the Fartygsreservningsnämnden, which is translated something like Ship Compensation Commission. And they measured all the refugee boats, took pictures of them, so when the boats and ships were already given to the Soviets, then already this meetings of the commission started, and debating over the sum of compensation to be paid by their previous owners. The thing with the wooden motorboats is that, especially by that time, is that they have to be in water to be usable, because on the when they're like put on the dry land and they're like the wood is shrinking and it's not possible to, they're not seaworthy anymore, and so by answering to the demands of the Soviets, the Swedish government also organized the reparation works of the boats that was made with the Swedish government money. And here from the left picture we can see that there's quite a big hole in one of the boats here. The gentleman is being through it. This picture is from Estonian book called Eesti põgenikud Rootsis, the Estonian refugees in Sweden. Ära sai tallab. Departure begins. A photo by an anonymous photographer. So what we see here is the Soviets taking the ships and boats back to Soviet Estonia. Well, actually, it was done with quite many several convoys over the last part of summer and the autumn of 1945. And now, what happened next to these vessels? If we take a look at the literature printed in Sweden during the last couple of decades over this topic, we see that people are quite convinced that the Soviets took back the refugee ships and boats, but their only intention was supposedly to show their power. They didn't need these boats, so to say, on the economic side, but it was just something to show the Swedish government their place. We are Soviets, we are the victors, it's World War, and we can do what we want on the Baltic Sea. And and if we take a look at the Swedish sources, we see that most of them come back to this one. It's actually a marvelous book, printed in Sweden some 25 years ago, called Gotland under beredskapsåren, which is like Gotland in the years of vigilance, so to say, as the Swedes call the World War II years in from the Swedish point of view. And from this quote, we can see that there is a eyewitness testimony of how the Soviets supposedly destroyed the boats that they had got somewhere in the middle of the Baltic Sea. Which is strange, because when we take a look at the Estonian refugee newspapers printed in Sweden from some 1946, so to say, they already know that the boats have been taken back to Estonia and put into use over there in Estonia. Well, it was no secret. If we take a look at the Soviet Estonian newspapers, we can see that the Soviets were very happy to receive the boats and ships, and they were put to use because they were really much in need of the equipment that could be used by the fishermen. So, yeah, the funny thing that we see here is well, this is more of a topic that would be very interesting by the researchers of collective memory, I guess. We can see some really interesting memory loss over here, I would say, regarding the Swedish Estonian diaspora over here. But yes, the archival documents in Estonian archives, they show the same. There were several Soviet convoys that took the boats back to Estonia, and the boats were spread for several fishermen's societies. And the Soviets were extremely happy over it, because even during the official statistics of Soviet Estonia, the numbers of all the fish that the Estonian fishermen could get, because in 1945 it was something like 25% of the amount that it was before the war. So it was quite a big thing in the economic sense as well, actually. And I wanted to trace, so to say, the fate of one specific boat. Okay, the fate of this boat is not a very common one, actually. It's quite special, because this Estonian refugee boat was attacked by the Soviet warplanes somewhere on the Baltic Sea. It was not common. If you read from the memoirs of Estonian refugees, most of them didn't spot any neither German or Soviet warplanes, and the ones that did, they just passed by usually. But we are a couple of cases that the refugee boats were really attacked by the Soviet warplanes. This is one of the cases. It was boat number AR1, which departed from Saaremaa to Sweden, and two of the passengers died because of the attack of the Russian warplane, Soviet warplane, because of the heavy machine gun fire. And it is possible to see also the dates and the main facts about this boat, how it was taken back to Estonia afterwards. And and yeah, it seems quite a good title for an article of it, which is from one of the Swedish history journal. We repaired the boats the Russians vandalized, and it was something that wasn't very nice to the Swedish psyche as well, certainly. On this picture, here's depicted one of the teams of carpenters, the Swedish carpenters that were sent from mainland Sweden to Gotland to repair the boats that were about to hand over to the Soviets. And there were at least a couple of teams of carpenters, each of them consisting of something like 30 people or so. And see that my time is over here. And if you have any further interest in this topic, I would suggest you to check out the Facebook group called Baltic Flyktingbåtar, Baltic Refugee boats, and of course check out the collection of articles by our institute, which will hopefully be out of printing house these days and available for obtaining through the Tartu University Press website. Thank you very much.
Any quick factual questions? I would just add for context, of course, that Sweden was one of the only Western countries which recognized the Soviet annexation of the Baltic countries. Martin?
Just to clarify, is my understanding correct that the Swedes not only returned the boats, but they had to pay 2.9 million Swedish crowns?
No, this money was paid for their actual previous owners, for the Estonian refugees. Yes.
Mark?
I'm confused about something. I noticed that 14 of the boats went back to Meelis, and I know that the people who lived right on that coast could not go fishing during Soviet times. So were there groups that could use those boats, or?
Yes, but it was extremely regulated going on the sea for the fishermen. Yeah.
Well, there's lots of hands.
You're only mentioning boats between Estonia and Sweden, but a number of them also went to Finland and eventually were helped by the Finnish government to go to Sweden. Do you know roughly what the breakout was between Sweden and Finland?
That's an excellent question, because now that we're so happy to have the list of the Estonian refugee boats that ended up in Sweden, we have almost nothing like this sort about the boats that ended up in Finland. It is known by some of the by several memoirs and some of the articles as well that the Estonian refugee boats that ended in Finland, in quite many cases, they were confiscated by the Finnish Coast Guard, but this confiscation was not official, so to say. It didn't ended up in some official papers. They were just used by the Coast Guard as their own, I don't know, some auxiliary means to do their work or something like that. And it is known that also several boat convoys were going back from Finland to the Soviet Estonia after the war. But right now, at this point, I don't know much about it yet.
Okay, we'll take two and then we'll follow the next. We might have more time at the end of the session.
Or we might not. Let's take the questions and then we won't have a final discussion. We'll just have questions directed to the next speaker afterwards. So, Mikael, go ahead and then Beth.
How long would a journey be without a motor from basically to Sweden?
If we take the main source in here is definitely the memoirs. And if we take a look at the memoirs, this, so to say, experience is very, very different. About how the weather conditions varied and so on. And also because of the very poor state of the boat motors and the lack of quality fuel for motorboats' engines. It was extremely lack of it during the German occupation and so on. It's very, very, very different. Well, mostly ranging from so to say, something around 20 hours to a week for a worse scenario.
Ed.
You have a list of all the 560 odd boats and ships that made it to Sweden. Do you have any sense of how many boats didn't make it, or how many started the journey but just were either bombed or capsized or whatever?
Any number that I would say would be a wild guess and a total speculation. So better not to say anything in this point.
Sorry about that. Just very quickly, Baltic Refugee Boats Facebook group is very, very good. It has about 2,000 members. You can send lists of people that you know that came on refugee ships, and you can research the refugees who are there. On a personal note, Martin Jungerman is a second cousin. His father had a 200-person passenger ship, and my mother and a number of other relatives fled Tammela on Martin Jungerman's grandfather's ship.
Thank you for the presentation, very interesting. Is there any idea why Sweden was so weak-kneed in conceding to giving back the boats and as Andres mentioned, early recognition of the occupation of the Baltic states? Is there any indication why Sweden was so weak-kneed? I mean, to the Russian claim that they were taking back stolen boats, that was spurious in itself. But did Sweden fear invasion by the Soviet Union? I just, it's perplexing to me why they were so weak-kneed with the Soviet Union.
The Swedes did what they need to do from their point of view to remain independent. It was one of the very, very few countries in Europe during the World War II that could remain independent and sovereign during the war, right? And it didn't come without anything, so to say. They had to do something for it, to make some compromises and so on. But actually here's another point as well. I'm not a specialist on this topic, but if we look from the memoirs, then we see that the Estonian fishermen, the Estonian refugee fishermen that ended up in Sweden, they couldn't occupation over there, because all of these fishing waters in the around the Swedish coast were already divided by their own fishermen, so to say, and such a big amount of new fishermen couldn't in any way fit in during some ecological and economical reasons for it. And well, if we take a look at that point, then by giving away the boats, perhaps the Swedish government,
Eliminate competition.
eliminated one problem that they would have been facing in the nearest future.
Our problem at the moment is time. And so the last question goes to our major sponsor.
Well, I've one comment here, and just intended to do what Tom Marley said. That site, and given this is an interest area of mine, it has an amazing amount of information, and Martin Jorgenman as well can direct you to police reports in the files of all civil defense in Sweden, etc. So if you really want to find information about what your parents and grandparents said when they entered the country, all that information is actually available if you want to file further and dig deeper. Thanks.
Okay, thank you, Hiljar. Thank you, Peter. Let's move on to the final presentation. And for those of you who had a question but didn't have a chance to ask, of course, during the lunch and the coffee break, go right up to the presenters and ask them directly. So we'll get to our final speaker, Meelis. So come up here and we'll get you set up. Meelis has a PhD in history from the University of Tartu, and he's a senior researcher at the Estonian Institute of Historical Memory. He's written a book, Propaganda and Terror, on the Stalinist period in Estonia. And he's going to be talking about those who couldn't flee, those who remained.
Thank you. Kind introduction. Head Eesti inimesed siin Põhja-Ameerikas, dear guests. Thanks for the invitation. And I was asked to talk instead of the Great Escape. Instead about what happened to those who didn't manage to escape, as Andres introduced me here. It can be argued, of course, that we already know everything relevant about this topic, and we should instead study Middle Ages or something, antiquities. This is, of course, irony. But, of course, at the same time, of course, it's not possible to cover this topic in details within 20 minutes, so I try to do it only in general terms. To begin with, it might be worth remembering what were the reasons of leaving homeland, especially Estonia and other Baltic states in the last years of World War II. Sources for this are, of course, memories, but also questionnaires of Swedish police, what the previous speaker talking about. Maybe broadly speaking, the reasons could be divided into three. One, people fled from the German occupation. Second one, they fled from direct fear of getting to the battle zone. And third, of course, fear of Russian occupation or Soviet occupation coming again. Let's start from the first one. Escape from the German or Nazi occupation. Yes, both terms were used. It started more widely to Finland in the final months of 1943, especially for fear of mobilization. Also, some families illegally fled to Finland. Estonian bureau was established there to deal with the refugee matters. What was their fate? And most of them, less than 2,000, returned to Estonia in August 1944, and they were still taken to German army. And some retreated from Estonia with German troops, some deserted, and large part of the latter were later captured by the Soviets also. In April 1944, also arrests of underground independence movement figures in Estonia began by German security police. As the activists of independence movement had contacts in Sweden, they tried to manage to help escape their family members. And because getting aid to the persons who were immediately threatened by Germans was the task of World Refugee Board. Also, they tried to justify their escape with the German or Nazi occupation threat. Even one of those who escaped to Sweden remembered in his testimony to the Swedish police, the Estonian interpreter deliberately added the Nazi occupation as a reason for his escape. And of course, those from the independence movement who couldn't manage to escape, we know what happened to them and lead with Otto Tief. Escape from real threat of battles. Bombings since the invasion of Red Army were one of the reasons for people leaving the cities, and often they continued to abroad. The casualties of the course of the battles, they are not fully counted. We can find names of civil victims in church registries and elsewhere, but losses still weren't very significant in Estonia because there were no enormous battles in cities or so. But inside of that, there was very harsh problem with marauding. There was even the communist rulers had in their own conversation thought that nearby the Tallinn there was no one farm which wasn't suffered by the Soviet soldiers in means of robbing. Not to talk about even so-called red partisans who killed people in dozens in 1944 in Finland, in Lithuania, but also in smaller amounts in Estonia. In reality, they were, of course, Soviet diversants. What happened in autumn of 1944 in freshly newly occupied Soviet territory, that was I would say it was kept under wraps after the war, and it was kind of pushed to the spheres of personal or family memory, from where it was not allowed to be released. And it was officially, if somebody dares to say something publicly, it was qualified as an anti-Soviet propaganda and slander. Besides that, we could say that the violence against civilian population in Baltic countries is perhaps better understood in the West today by the example of what is happening in Ukraine. Well, from here we come to the last but not least important topic, escape from the Soviet power and its terror. Of course, what happened in the first red year of 1940-41, the killings, imprisonments, and deportations were quite well known. And also, this was exploited quite well by Germans to threaten Estonians, but not only by them. Also, famous figures of national movement like Jüri Uluots or aforementioned Admiral Pika, they also thought that entire Estonian nation would be destroyed when the Russians came back. And those who are not killed immediately will be deported to Siberia. Because that was the kind of atmosphere of fear and threat then. And here we come into the question, did the Soviets and their henchmen really plan those scale of terror or genocide? Yeah, we don't have no real proof for today, and maybe never we will see it. But the determination of all of the population, that could be not even useful for Soviets, because they needed new recruits for the army, they needed someone who feeds them. So they kind of started so-called cleansing, which was tasked to the NKVD and state security. And for that, the so-called operational groups of NKVD and state security were formed also on November 30th, 1943. It was the same time when the Tehran conference with the Allies was still going on. It shows something, probably. It shows that the decision to Sovietize the Baltic countries was already made by Stalin before the Tehran conference. And of course, at that time also the preparations for Red Army's attack under Leningrad were going on. To somewhat more precisely target the groups which were to be arrested by Soviets, the Soviet state security leader Merkulov issued a directive in March of 1944. There were categories of people who were to be arrested, were listed. Of course, the first step, first importance, there were so-called agents of German intelligence, but also it ended with members of previous political parties of Baltic states, and so etc., etc., even the journalists, which were regarded as so-called anti-Soviet. And what began after the recapture of Estonia was a real mass operation. It's the Soviet term, of course, meaning that the people were arrested in very large proportions. In November of 1944, there was also forceful mobilization to the Red Army. And the next year, in 1945, large-scale raids at woods to catch up the people who were hiding themselves followed. In 1945 is maybe the worst year in history of Stalinist period in Estonia. Also, it's worth to mention that the executions of those who were sentenced to death began in Tallinn in March 1945. Here we come to the question, how many people were still left to Estonia to repress? So, according to the NKVD data, the total circa 835,000 inhabitants in Estonia were registered by January 1st of 1945. And this number includes a little bit more than 228,000 men. So much for full Estonia, including also those ones who came back from Soviet Union. So, and if we now compare it with the number of people who were arrested during the 1944-1945, so now we estimate that there were approximately up to 17,000 arrests. So that's quite a percent, isn't it? Why I say approximately is because we still don't have in Estonia the whole data about people, and we don't believe the pieces of Soviet statistics. I mean, we who work in Estonian Institute of Historical Memory with the database of repressed people. So our method is to make sure every arrested, killed or deported one by the name, and also to make sure even a little bit information about their fate. If we talk about the whole number of people who were either murdered by political reasons or arrested or deported in Estonia during the whole Soviet occupation time, we estimate that this number is around 75,000, a little bit more. And from this contingent we have now information about 23,000 people who either were murdered or died during this Soviet terror. Yeah, but of course, these are only numbers and they don't reflect the real human tragedy. What else I would like to say? During the last decades, I have heard here and there the critique for kind of dominance of narrative of suffering, so-called, in Estonia. I would say that we cannot avoid bringing suffering and fear to the fore when we discuss Stalin's time or the Soviet occupation in general. Even considering that most of the people kind of survived the Soviet period also in Estonia, not even counting those whom the Soviets led a pretty good life for their merits in Estonia. But the life of the common man also remained overshadowed by fear, which in its most severe form came from this time which we were talking about, the time of war. So maybe that could be the short answer to my topic, and we could stop now. Thank you for attention.
Thank you, Meelis. We're still more or less on time, so we can have a few short questions before we go to the film.
Everything is understandable.
It was all very grim.
Thank you.
Okay, well then, we will proceed to a brand new, this is at least a North American premiere, at least of a brand new film produced by Meelis Institute. It's in Institute of Historical Memory. The title is Fleeing, Departure into the Unknown. It's not a long film, but it's not a short film either. 50 minutes. And Ulla Kraft from the Institute will say a few words in introduction to the film.
Thank you. I'm Ulla Kraft, data analyst of the Estonian Institute of Historical Memory. The film you will see next has been compiled as a result of the Estonian Memory Institute work over the past 2 years. The Institute has collected written memories, interviewed people who still remember those times, compiled a database of refugees in cooperation with the archives of Estonia, Germany, Canada, and the USA, and made some primary analysis. Today, we have reached the first results, a preliminary overview of the countries where Estonians fled to. The research of the period following their arrival to Sweden, Germany, or elsewhere is still ongoing. And the author of the film is our colleague Marko Polaris. Enjoy the movie.